Okay, question number 2 from Tuesday said, assume that the loanable funds market in country X is currently in equilibrium. First part we need to do, draw a correctly labeled graph of loanable funds for country X. Label the equilibrium interest rate as R asterisk and the quantity of funds as QF asterisk. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Right. We know that it's the real interest rate and the quantity of loanable funds. We're in equilibrium, so supply and demand are going to intersect. So supply, demand, and it said to label the real interest rate as R asterisk and the quantity of loanable funds here as what they want, QF asterisk. Okay? All right, so we got that taken care of. That's part A. All right. Now it says, assume the government of country X, which has a balanced budget, which means they're not spending more than they're taking in revenue. They want to increase their spending, but they're going to hold taxes constant. So they're not coming up with a new revenue source. Right? They're increasing spending, but there's not a new revenue source. And it says now, assume that the government funds that increase with increased borrowing. Okay, so there's going to be more pressure on the loanable funds market now because we're increasing our borrowing, but we're not coming up with a new source of revenue to cover that spending. What will be the impact of this policy action on the government's budget balance? All right, the budget will move towards deficit, right? Because we're borrowing and spending more than we're taking in revenue. So we're going to move towards deficit. Now it says on the graph in part A, what would the impact of this policy be on the interest rate and the quantity of funds? So this is that situation where we talked about with the government. You can show it two ways. You can show this through an increase in the demand for loanable funds or a decrease in the supply. I always like to stick to an increase in the demand for loanable funds. I think it's easier to explain because the government is demanding more out of the loanable funds market. So that would be an increase in the demand. We can see that the quantity of funds supplied would increase a little bit. And here's our new real interest rate. So the real interest rate rises, and this is the key, the idea that the real rate of interest is rising. Why is it that the quantity of funds supplied increases a little bit? Well, the real reason for that is because investors are seeing a higher rate of return, a higher real interest rate, so it's encouraging them to put some money in the bank. So now there's a greater quantity of funds available because those higher rates encourage a little bit more investment into the banking system because of that higher return. Okay. Part C, given your answer in part 2 from B, how will private sector interest-sensitive expenditures be affected? Remember we said that they will decrease. Because of the higher rate of interest here, it's going to be more difficult for businesses to borrow and invest, and as a result, that spending decreases. All right, so interest-sensitive expenditures will decrease because of this higher rate of interest. Okay, it's going to be more difficult for businesses to borrow and invest. And then for D, it says, given your answer in part C, what's the impact on the long-run growth rate of the economy, and explain? The long-run growth rate here is going to decline. The reason why the long-run rate of growth would decline is because since businesses are spending less now because of higher rates of interest, okay? And remember we've talked about one of the things that businesses rely on as far as spending is they have to borrow sometimes. Like if they want to build a new factory or invest in research and development, things like that, they're going to have to borrow money. If the rates are too high and it's too expensive to borrow, they won't do that. And then as a result, you're not going to get the expanded productive capability that you would hope for. And so because of those higher rates, we're going to see a lower rate of growth in the long run as a result. Okay? So that's question 2 from Tuesday.